Hi there. I hope you've been having fun with this course so far. The reality may be that this is actually a pretty difficult question to answer, because what is fun actually? So this is what we'll be talking about in this particular pre-recorded lecture for today. And the structure of that will all be about fun, particularly about how we have fun with the past. But we'll start basically by what fun even is, and then also how we can study it, particularly in the context of games. And then also we'll sort of skip to a very particular study of fun, how we have fun right now as a large group of people, a large group of players with the past in video games. So, when it comes to video games, it is often referred to as being the biggest entertainment marker. These are basically video games are basically the biggest fun machines on the planet. From a financial perspective, at least, it's a bit of up in the air whether what segment of the entertainment industry is actually bigger. But suffice to say, as you can see right here, games are very much, from a financial perspective, a very much a growing market still. And one of the biggest ones when it comes to how we have fun, right? And having fun is quite literally at the core of this whole industry. And for an industry that is built on something, one very specific thing, I mean, there's all sorts of other things that you can have with games, obviously, and we'll talk about those during this course at length. But for something that is built on this one specific thing, it's actually pretty hard to start to think about what that thing is, right? So, fun, often, when it is being referred to in our daily lives, it is, of course, something fun, something pleasurable, something enjoyable, but also it is often contrasted, at least here in the West, right, where we've been growing up, as something fun being childish or unproductive or nonsensical or ludicrous. Fun really gets a bad rap, and it would go way too far to go into the whole cultural history of fun, and in fact such a thing has not really been written or researched yet. However, there's a very nice book that if you want to read it, I absolutely recommend it if you want to know more about fun and its sort of cultural background and its cultural history. That's Fun, Taste and Games by John Sharp and David Thomas. So in that particular book, they outline fun, well, first of all, of course, as something that you'll know it when you have it. Basically, if you're having fun, you know that you're having fun, but it can be very hard to actually explain about it and talk about it. And that's what they're trying to do in this game, particularly approaching it from an aesthetics point of view. So from our experiential point of view and all our particular senses and sensibilities that go with that. So for them, fun consists of 3 ingredients. Set outsideedness. This very much confers to the magic circle that Sibyl discussed in her first lecture. And the idea that, it can't be very serious. It can't be it can be serious, absolutely, but it cannot be something that is, that is part of regular goings along, right? The idea of something contained within itself. At the same time, it is, of course, maybe an open door, but also maybe not, right? Fun always has ludic elements. That means it is always something playful. Whether that fun is, being had in completely losing yourself in study, or whether it's completely losing yourself in a game, there's always a ludic element to it. At least that's what John Sharp and David Thomas contend. Or at least that's one of the core aspects of having fun. Aside from that, it is also something that has to do with ambiguity. So what they mean by that is that, this is the thing we say it is, and this is not the thing that we say it is. So when you're having fun, you're actually, it's also a little bit of a joke, right? There's something going on. This is also the idea of mimicry, of course, in Huizinga's Magic Circle, the idea that games mimic life, but are not really it. Or maybe they are, right? This is the 3 core elements that fun consists of for Sharp and Thomas. And to sort of not necessarily counter that, but to provide a slightly different perspective that I find a little bit more intuitive. It doesn't work across the board, but it's something, interesting to sort of start with as a basic definition, is the definition by Ian Bogost in his Play Anything book. Another book that I warmly recommend you read, is that fun is any activity that is related to with commitment, care, and attention. So those three are other core aspects of fun, right? And of course, if you can sort of recognize this for yourself, if you're having fun, if you're playing, you do this with commitment, attention, and care. If you don't do that, you're probably not having fun, right? And in my own work, but also just I think in general, especially also when it comes to game design, fun is something that we understand as a central aesthetic of games. And particularly, I'm very interested in how it relates to how we have fun with the past. So, to give an example of this, we're going to go back to the very, very first time that we had fun with the past in a computerized game. It's not entirely a video game, if you want to be very picky about definitions, because the visual element of it was very much underemphasized in this game. Because it's a very old game in which you didn't really have much screens, right? You didn't have many television screens and they weren't connected like that. No, in fact, this game, the Sumerian game from 1964, which had all sorts of incarnations later on, for example, as Hammurabi or Sumer or the Sumer game. There's all sorts of different names after that are slightly different versions of this particular one thing. And that one thing is that in this case, particularly, it was an experiment with kids and economic learning games. And this particular economic learning game was set in the past. Participants were being asked to imagine that they've been made the ruler of Lagash, which was this city-state in Sumer, right? This is all, if you want to see the historical background behind this, I recommend you watch a very long video that is out on YouTube that I'm sure we'll link to somehow, in which we basically discuss both the actual history and the history of this game. So people were being asked to imagine they were the rulers of an ancient Near East city and making all sorts of very particular economic decisions. How to invest food, how to distribute food to your people, but also how to plant bushels that you had in store for new food for the next growing season, etc. And the way that this was set up was, as you can see on the screen right here, participants, kids, were being asked to sit in front of a terminal, so quite literally something that they could type on, and then they would also be seeing images that sort of for extra visual context of that game. These were still images, these were basically not photos, dioramas. They were actually photos of dioramas that were shown. They were also hearing audio. So it was, especially for the 1960s, it was quite a state-of-the-art experience. Not quite, actually a state-of-the-art experience. And all of that was being interfaced using a data phone, so a phone that was particularly transmitting the choices that these participants were making in the game back to a mainframe. A big old computer that now probably has fewer computing power than we have in mobile phones from even 10 years back. But that was really the very first time that we had fun with the past. It's also, in fact, according to some, the very first critical, the very first narrative experience, as explained by Kate Willard from Critical Hit. She did a whole podcast, a whole blog post on this. We'll link to that as well. So, the question is, with this very, well, for us elementary, but for that time very sort of outstanding game, the central question for this whole project was, can people learn about the past? Or in fact, can people learn about economy through this? And can they do that in this particular way? And of course, there was evaluation done on this study afterwards. So this already allows us to have a little look at what people, at the very first instance of us having fun with the past in video games, considered to be fun in this game. So in fact, out of the experiment, which it was super small, we're only like a bit more than a dozen participants. 8 of them liked Sumer best. And basically, a couple of the reasons for that Sumer was more interesting because it had taken place. It was, actual history. Something about being a king is also apparently very attractive when you play a game. And yeah, exactly, being the master of the game, being really sort of in charge, right? The dying population knew better as game went on. The whole idea of learning from your mistakes, learning from your past in this particular case, had to think harder, liked special messages, the whole setting around it. Is there anything about the courses that you specifically did not like? So these were games dressed up as courses. So there were some things that they didn't like, too long, boring. The Sumer game was too repetitious, and it also forced the right answers to the discussion. You couldn't do otherwise. So these are already very interesting core elements that steer the fun that people had in this very, very early game, right? And it also underlined that these particular players wanted to have much more fun with history. So when they were asked, do you want to, what other subject would you like to be on? Well, 5 of them said, we want more history. Italy from long ago, maybe Rome, maybe the Renaissance, who knows? The Middle Ages. So this clearly was history experiencing the past through a game already was something that was quite fun that they wanted to do more of. And remember that these players were 11 to 12, and I think they gave brilliant answers already. And these people are now 65 plus. So all of this sort of underlines that there's this larger thing that you can do when you play games. And we've already been doing a little bit of this, right? You can analyze the game, right? You can do game analytics. And game analytics are very often focused on experiences. So understanding the experience that people are having. And as we already established, fun experience is one of the core that many games, one of the core things that many games try to create. So you focus obviously on player experiences, and there you can go for autoethnography. So you can start, as I described in my first lecture, you can do your study of your own experiences and why you were having fun at what particular moment, for example. But of course, you can also do this in a larger way, such as we're doing in the Past at Play Lab, where we do this larger data-driven, quote-unquote, more objective, so at least not completely focused on the self as subject, right? In which we do surveys, we do activity tracking, etc. You can also get about these experiences in maybe a bit more roundabout ways. For example, by studying or analyzing player reviews and discussions. And for example, when they evaluate, just as we saw with the Sumer game just now, when they evaluate what things they thought were fun and what things weren't fun. When they discuss the content of the game, so what things did stand out to them when it came to content. And also, of course, when they reflect themselves in reviews or discussions that they have. So reviews, for example, on Steam, a platform we'll get to in a bit, or discussions that you can have in all sorts of fora, for example, Reddit. And there you can, for example, one of the things that we'll say is that they will be impacted in certain ways, emotionally, cognitively, or whatever, right, by having played a game. So I'm not going to go too much into how you can go about that, these close reading and distant reading of people's evaluations of games and discussions around games. But if you're interested, I'll also link to this other YouTube video, another 20-minute presentation on having done exactly that, studying the Battlefield subreddit and one of its biggest sort of discussions it had around history in games. Another way of doing game analytics is a bit more quantitative, right? It's a bit more focused on player numbers, game sales. It becomes quite indirect from the experience of fun. But if millions and millions of people play a game, there must be, and if the whole purpose of that game is to be fun, right? Or not the whole purpose, but a core purpose of it is to be fun. There's probably something in that game that is particularly fun, at least for millions and millions of players, right? That on the flip side of that a game is not played by millions of players does not necessarily indicate that it isn't fun for you personally, or just even in general, objectively speaking. That can have all sorts of other reasons. For example, having to do with PR budgets or, brand recognition, all sorts of, things that are sort of a little bit outside of the scope of simply looking at sales numbers. At the same time, sales numbers and other numbers that come with information that is being gathered on how often we play games, what games we play, what the content on them can be very interesting, especially if you can get at them. And there's this very interesting website out there that I often use and that we often use for our research called steamspy.org. And SteamSpy is quite literally that. It spies on Steam. It does so, I think, with the consent of Steam. That's a little bit in a gray area, but it's been operating for a long time already and hasn't been taken down. So I'm going to guess there's some sort of understanding between the owners of Valve, of the Steam platform, and the owner of the SteamSpy platform. But what SteamSpy does, it gathers a lot of data from users on Steam, which is the biggest, one of the biggest gaming platforms, so for buying games as well as for playing games in the world. Right now, for example, in 2020, it's now 2021, but in 2020, Steam had about 120 million active users per month. And right now there are 44,000 games, more than 44,000 games on Steam. And one of these things that Steam allows you to do when you're a user, when you're playing games on Steam, it allows you to tag these games. So, for example, you can say that I've played this game and I think actually this game is very, is about action, or that this game is about having an adventure, or that this game is single player focused, or that it is narratively focused, or that it's very atmospheric, or that it has a good soundtrack. There's all sorts of tags, more than 300, that you can apply to these games on Steam as a player yourself. And interestingly, one of these tags is the historical tag. And more than 1,700 games right now, currently, are being tagged on Steam as being historical. And what we're going to be doing now in the upcoming minute, we're just going to look at a lightly edited trailer of the biggest historical game by sales and likely also player numbers on Steam. So this game, War Thunder, is a very particular type of game. And as you can see here in this particular graph that charts the number of owners versus the amount of games having those number of owners, you can see that War Thunder is the sole, rests at the top. Between 20 million to 50 million people have War Thunder in their Steam accounts. There's all sorts of other bigger games out there, and also a lot of smaller games that have anywhere between 0 to 20,000 number of owners. What you will see when we're just briefly looking at this is something that I'm sure was also quite clear from watching the trailer just now is that particularly the largest games are very specific experiences of fun with the past. So we have, for example, War Thunder. We have World of Warships. We have Heroes and Generals, also another game with 10 to 20 million users. We have Chivalry Medieval Warfare. This very graphic and in-your-face medieval combat simulator, I'll say lightly. Company of Heroes, another war game. And if you will look at the largest historical games in terms of number of owners on Steam, you will see that many of them are very much about war and violence, or alternatively about competition. The games that have fewer owners, sometimes even as few as less than 20,000, are games that provide experiences of the past, and if you know them, you'll probably recognize them. And I'll also put this image up on the website and on Brightspace, so you can study it a bit more in depth. They are games that provide a much more varied experience in terms of content and in terms of aesthetics, and also in terms of, I would say, mechanics, largely speaking, of the past. That doesn't mean that they're, for example, not violent, that there's not action in them, but they do try to do things a bit differently. A good example is Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, a really good game that I'll recommend you try out. Mulaka, another game that is something, has an very interesting take. It's a platformer puzzle game, but it has this aesthetic that is completely focused on the indigenous people, which are the central part of the narrative, as well as giving life to the whole style of the game. Another interesting example from Dutch soil is Cross of the Dutchman. This is not necessarily a game that is not violent, but it is very much focused on this local heritage, and particularly the local heritage of Gut de Pier, this Frisian folk hero that basically kicked the Hollanders, so the Dutch, quote unquote, ass in the medieval period. Another game that is very out of the ordinary is Ancestors. So all of these are smaller games. And these are the types of games that I'm not necessarily saying that they're better or more fun. In fact, probably, there's lots of people having a lot of fun with these other larger games. But there's much more varied experiences to be found in them. Much more varied also narratives of the past to be found on them. In contrast to these blockbuster historical games that very much focus on war and violence. So drilling into this, using Steam tags a little bit more, we can also sort of even start to look at a couple of different groupings. So these are all, this is a network of tags that co-occur with games that are also tagged as being historical. So, for example, a game will be tagged as being historical. It will also be tagged, it will also be likely to be tagged as medieval, or a classic game, or a military or World War II game. So, largely speaking here, you can start to identify 3 general clusters of types of experiences within games that are, that the majority of us have, or at least the majority of us end up tagging in Steam. So, strategy, broadly speaking, strategy, right? Games, which, as I already said, are focused on tactical, turn-based strategy, will have something to do with Rome or wargaming. These are all things, so it's important to understand that these tags can also co-occur with other games that are not within the genre of strategy, but they sort of are more likely to co-occur with these strategy tags. And once again, I will also put this image on the website, so you can also have a closer look at it if you like. Another example of a game type set in the past is adventure games. And adventure games are adventure games that are, generally speaking, atmospheric. They provide you with adventures. They are also one of the very famous series within this quote-unquote family of games is, of course, Assassin's Creed, which is where you can also see the Assassin's Creed or the Assassin tag there. Naval exploration, story-rich. Those are the types of games that are adventure games. But all of them still very much revolve around action as well as war. Same thing goes for shooters, right? First person perspective. So you sort of see the world in the game as if you look through your character's eyes. Shooter games, so games in which you shoot stuff, or you shoot with stuff, first-person shooters, realistic, and those are also the games that have, according to Steam users, the most action in it. So this point underlies the larger point that I already made in the previous slide, is that when it comes to the past and the type of fun that we have with it, it seems like there's a lot of richness and there's a lot of different experiences. This is true, especially if you start evaluating this from a personal level. Of course, every single experience that we have with the past through games is in some ways unique. However, if you zoom out a little bit by looking at these more quantitative or large data-driven approaches, or you take these large data-driven approaches, you see that while we think we may have lots of different games set in the past, and we will have lots of different types of fun in the past, it's actually pretty contained. They're very much about warfare in the past, about violence and competition in the past. And this, of course, is a general staple of games, but at the same time, it is important that we recognize that the fun that we currently have with the past is very much focused, for the largest majority of us, is very much focused along these lines. This is not a value judgment, this is a simple statement of fact. After that, we can have a discussion about whether that is interesting or not, to have, in fact, so many games focused on violence. So that really is the larger discussion that I think we should have as a video game playing community, or as a community that is interested in how the past is represented and worked with in today's society. Because video games are fun machines, and they're also time machines, right? This is something we'll talk about as well during this course. They are definitely about set outsidedness, right? This is a core element of them, but the experiences that you have in them will also have an impact on you. As I really wasn't talking about that particular point right here, but it comes across very clearly from the Battlefield study that I will link to as well. They're ludic, they're playful, but their playfulness for the vast majority is very much about violence and competition, right now at least. And of course, if we look at the possible diversity of play, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? We can have all sorts of playful experiences. There's all sorts of things that we can connect with in a spirit of care, commitment, and attention that are not necessarily based on violent mechanics. At the same time, they're also ambiguous, right? So we know we're not playing with an actual past, but at the same time, we find it very important often that these pasts are somehow authentic to us, that they are realistic, that they are these things that sort of convince us that this thing could actually have taken place, or that we're actually immersed within the game. To get at this, we really need more theories of fun, particularly theories of fun with the past. And this, of course, goes beyond fun with the past through games, I would say. There's all sorts of connections that you can say to other media, absolutely, but also simply to how fun it is to go to a museum, for example. Because in a way, these are always different media that give us access to the past. And then when it comes to that, when we have those theories, it's very important to scaffold those theories, to check if they're not basically the view that we have because of our own experiences, but to see how they check out with how the larger majority of us is also having fun with the past. So this is really what game analytics is about. And at least for me, and now we're getting to the part where you can maybe make a value judgment, I'm really interested in using those insights to make play with the past more informed. So from a knowledge perspective, but also from a perspective of understanding how we're actually playing with the past. Also more political, having a discussion about whether we like the way that we're playing with the past currently, or whether we want to have changes with that and whether we should change that. Because I feel that there should be a more diverse approach to our play with the past, particularly in today's video games. And I think that all those three things will benefit not only people studying this, but it will also benefit the players and the game designers. Because I do think that if you get these three ingredients together, and this view is shared also by the other teachers in this course, that playing with the past can also become more fun. Thank you for your attention. This was a pretty long one, so hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun, and we'll see you next time. Bye.